Hi everyone, welcome to the BrioHR webinar. Today actually we're going to be talking about employer branding on a shoestring. I've been involved in employer branding for many years now. I've been lucky enough to work in some companies that have a budget for this kind of thing, that have a marketing team, a creative team, copywriters, but I've also worked in companies that have none of these things and I have to do it all myself. So I'm really excited today to be able to share with you my top 5 tips for employer branding on a shoestring. I've got a kid running around today. I've got a dog somewhere. So hopefully they won't be too distracting. So I hope you've got a coffee. I've sure got mine. So let's jump in to my top 5 tips for employer branding on a shoestring. Tip number one of the most important ones is content is king. I think you probably all heard that expression before. Ultimately, the fastest way to improve your employer brand is to get content out there. Uh, as I mentioned, there's a big problem for this. If you're an HR person who typically employer branding falls to the HR person to have to deal with, but typically you might not have experience in producing amazing visuals, editing videos, uh, uh, creating compelling and impulsive copywriting. But actually, if you want to have a strong employer brand, which is going to draw the right candidates to apply for your company and it's going to help you find the right candidates, then you have to get good at copywriting. You have to get good at graphic design. You have to learn how to edit videos so that you can produce interesting and compelling content for your employer brand. And if you're not able to do this, there's simply no other way for you to get your employer brand out there. It doesn't matter how good it is to work for your company. It doesn't matter how amazing the employee experience is. If you don't have a way to communicate that to people outside of your company, it's simply not going to work. So my biggest advice is to actually self-teach yourself how to create amazing visuals, how to edit videos, and how to produce interesting and impulsive copywriting. There's lots of free tutorials online, but actually it doesn't really matter because there's so many free or cheap tools available now. You don't need to learn how to use Photoshop. You've got things like Canva. You don't need to learn how to use this complicated video editing software because actually you can do it on your phone with the free software that comes with the phone. It might not be the most amazing quality in the world, but actually you don't need it to be amazing. You just need it to be good. And it's very easy to create good content just with free tools, with free software, with the software that comes free with your phone. So make sure you take full advantage of these kind of things, learn how to use them, and take that first step into producing content for your employer brand. But you don't have to start completely from scratch either. I think my biggest advice when it comes to producing content is to look at other people's content. Go on LinkedIn, go on Facebook, look for other people's employer branding content, which you find very, very appealing. And try and look at it and work out what actually makes it appealing to you. What are the elements within that visual? What are the elements within that video which are making you pay attention, which are making it attractive to you? And try and work out how you can incorporate all of those things within your own content. So don't think you have to start from scratch. Just look at other people's employer branding, especially the branding which is very attractive to you, and take inspiration from that. So that's tip number one, content is king. Tip number two is to know your platforms. Again, there's 2 key platforms that you want to take full advantage of when you're starting your employer brand. There's many, many different platforms that you can use, but there's really 2 key ones which you have to have. One of them is your job postings, and the second one is social media. So if we jump into job posting, one of the key things is you need to understand the difference between a job description and a job advert. And it's very easy to mistake the two. They're very similar. But you can't use a job description to attract people to your company. You have to use a job advert. A job description is what you use to tell your current employees what their job is. a job advert is what you use to attract people to join your company or to apply for your company or to be interested in your company. So you really have to start to make that distinction, and start again to educate yourself on how to produce interesting and compelling and impulsive job adverts, which are going to make people come to your company and apply for the jobs that you're posting. I think first and foremost, fundamentally, a job advert has to sell the company. You have to talk about the company. You have to talk about why the company is succeeding, what's happening at the company, and you have to sell the role, which means not talking about the day-to-day tasks that this role has to perform. It means talking about the results that this role is expected to get. You have to talk about what's in it for the candidate. You know, why is joining your company and doing this role, why is that going to work for them? You really got to let the candidate or the audience who is reading this job advert really understand what's in it for them. And one of the biggest mistakes I find in job adverts is asking for qualifications, asking for minimum years of experience, and listing all these reasons why people shouldn't apply for the job. As in, unless you have this, you shouldn't be applying. It completely turns people off when you talk about negatives like that. So make sure that rather than talking about all these reasons why people shouldn't apply for the job, talk about the reasons that they should. Talk about the abilities that people would need in order to do this job, rather than qualifications or years of experience or things like this. And also understand that most people skim read job adverts. If you go on any job board, you can just skim through all the available jobs. A lot of people will apply purely based on the title, and most people won't spend more than 4 to 10 seconds reading a job advert. So make sure you can get as much information across in the early parts of the job advert as possible. Make sure you use very simple and easy to absorb formatting in terms of bullet points and short paragraphs, rather than just blocks of text and things like this. It really makes a huge difference. It makes it easier to read. It makes it easier to absorb the information very, very quickly. And you will lose candidates purely because they're not reading all the way to the end. I think another big mistake that people make when they are writing job adverts is they target them at people who are job hunting. And actually, that's a mistake. You shouldn't target them at people who are job hunting. You should target them at people who are currently very happy with their job, currently doing a good job in a good company, and try and convert them into people that want to work for your company. That's who you should be targeting. If you think about who your perfect candidate is, your perfect candidate should be the best person possible to do that role within your budget. And if they really are that good, they're probably not looking for a job. If they really are that good, they've probably already got a good job and it's going well. That's who you want to be targeting with your job ads. So you really do have to make it as impulsive as possible to try and get these people who are not really looking for or actively looking for a new job, try and convert them into people who are suddenly very interested in your company. I think for me, the best portals or channels to use for posting your jobs, especially in Southeast Asia where I'm based, is LinkedIn, Glassdoor, and then just choose one or two local job boards as well. And if you've got those channels or platforms, then you can't really go wrong with your job posting. And then we move on to social media. I think one of the biggest changes to recruitment in the last 10 years has been the rise of social media, especially LinkedIn. But now, of course, even with Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, these are all very, very necessary channels if you want to get your content and your employer brand out there to the masses. And if you're not on these channels, if you don't have a company page on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, you're missing out on a huge potential. And if we're talking about passive candidates, again, the candidates that you want, the people that you want to join your company, assuming you're looking for the best in the market, they're probably not looking on job boards, but they're almost definitely on social media. So if you're looking at where you want to spend your money or spend your time in terms of building your employer brand and posting jobs, it actually shouldn't be on job boards. it should be on social media. And guess what? Social media is free, and job boards cost money. So again, if you're on a shoestring, social media is actually a much better option to post your content than and post your jobs than actual job boards themselves. So you need to be on LinkedIn. You need to be on Facebook. You should be producing videos for YouTube. You should be on Instagram. We live in a digital world now, and if you're not on these platforms, you're simply missing out. Your brand just will not be able to reach the type of candidates that you want to bring on board. So that's tip number 2. Tip number 3 is get a culture. I think everyone talks about company culture. It's a very fashionable HR topic these days, and for good reason. It's very, very important to your current employees. If you want to develop a strong culture where people can thrive, where people can hit good productivity rates, and where attrition is low, you have to focus on your culture. They say not focusing on culture generally produces a toxic culture. And if you have a toxic culture, it really affects your productivity. It really affects the success of the company. And ultimately, from a recruitment point of view and an employer branding point of view, it's going to make your job 10 times harder. You're going to lose employees faster, which means you have to spend more time on recruitment than you would have to anyway. And it means your employee brand is starting at a negative. You have to kind of claw your way back from a negative perception, a negative employer brand, and build it up into a positive. So the first place to start is culture. If you're wondering what to produce content about, you should be talking about your culture. And if you have no real culture to talk about, then the first thing you want to be doing when you're building an employer brand is start to create a culture for your company. If you think this is not important, or if you have bosses who think this is not important, then you need to learn how to convince them. You need to learn how to convince them that actually culture is something that you should focus on. If you want to employ the best people in the country, the best people for the job, you need to be focused on building a culture that will attract the top performers, the best employees. It's the easiest place to start when you're trying to build an employer brand. But culture, it has a very elusive feel about it. I mean, how do you define culture? How do you build culture? It's something that's very intangible. It's very hard to measure, and therefore it's very hard to know where to start. I think I read a great article a few years ago, and it's really built the foundations of where I like to start when I'm talking about culture, and that's really about behaviors. It's about coming up with a process, simple values that can start to define the types of behaviors that you think are important and positive, but also the types of behaviors that you think are negative. And then look for ways to how you can drive the positive behaviors and start to remove those negative behaviors. And it really comes down to 4 things: how you recognize your employees and how they recognize each other, how you give recognition to each other, how you communicate with each other, and how your company communicates externally as well, but also how you empower your employees and how you let them empower each other, and how you develop your employees, and again, how you let them develop each other. If you can nail these 4 things, recognition, communication, empowerment, and development, if you can nail these 4 things, those are really the bedrock and the foundation of your culture. And once you have a culture that can really be defined, that's what you can start to base all of your employer branding around. It really is that simple. People always ask me what they should talk about when they're talking about their employer brand. They think they should talk about their benefits, how much they pay, salaries, etc., etc. But really, you should be talking about your culture, because that's the one thing that is very consistent about what people are look for in a company, and it's really where you should focus most of your efforts. So that's tip number 3: get a culture. Very, very important. Tip number 4, very, very related to this one, is tell the truth. You can't lie in your employer brand. And again, you see it over and over again when you go on social media, especially LinkedIn. You have these employer brands, people talking about what it's like to work in their company, and you just know it's bullshit. You know it's not true because it's too good to be true. They talk about how amazing it is, how everyone is 100% committed to the company values, this, that, and the other, and you just know it's impossible. No company has that culture where every single person loves what they do. Every single person is 100% committed. It's just not true. And when you read it straight away, you start to realize that this company is exaggerating, they're lying, and that puts you off straight away. So make sure you're always telling the truth. If you start to exaggerate unbelievably, if you start to lie about what the employee experience is like in your company, it's going to do two things. One, your current employees are going to see this and they're going to know it's not true, and they're going to start to associate you with dishonesty, which is something that you really don't want. Especially if you are an HR person, you don't want your employees to start associating what you say with dishonesty, or starting to see you lying to new employees or potential employees. It's just not the environment you want, and that is the base of a toxic culture. So make sure you don't exaggerate and lie in your employer brand. But the other thing it's going to do, which is almost more impactful, is that people are going to join your company on the basis of the lies that you're telling in the employer brand. And as soon as they join, they're very quickly going to realize that what they saw on YouTube, on Facebook, on LinkedIn, what they saw in all this amazing content that you're producing, they're going to realize that it's not true. And you're going to see your attrition spike. As soon as people realize that they've been lied to, that they've been misled, that the environment is not what they were told it was going to be, they're going to leave very quickly. And again, you start to get a negative employer brand. You work so hard on producing content, producing videos, producing visuals, and then suddenly it's all that effort is wasted because your employer brand becomes negative. Your culture becomes toxic because people start to associate what you're saying with dishonesty, and they know that you're lying. So make sure you always tell the truth in your employer brand. And that's why, again, going back to the previous point, you do have to start with culture. And if you don't have a culture, you have to build it. You can't just create a culture on paper. You have to talk about the real culture you have. So sometimes you have to take a step back from your employer brand and think, we need to fix the culture here before we can start talking about employer brand. So make sure you are not telling little white lies, exaggerating things. It needs to start with truth. So that's tip number 4. And then tip number 5, the last tip, is always be kind. Kindness always wins. If you're looking for a place to really start when it comes to your employer brand, start with kindness. There's so many things that people want from their employer. Some people want a high salary. Some people want remote work. Some people want an environment where they can be taught and mentored and learn and develop. There's so many different audiences that you need to try and target your employer brand at. And every position within your own company, you will need to target certain different demographics. And it can get very difficult and almost confusing to know where to target your employer brand at. What kind of audience are you targeting? But one thing that almost everyone has in common about what they want from their employer is an environment that's filled with kindness. So if you are not sure what to talk about when you are building your employer brand, if you don't really know how to define your culture, even if you have what you would imagine is a good culture, if you don't really know how to define it and you want to know where to start with kindness. Look for examples of how your employees are kind to each other. Look for examples of how the company is kind to employees. Look for examples of how the company and employees are kind to people outside in terms of the charity events that they do. And try to talk about these as much as possible within your employer brand. Again, it creates a pattern of behavior. Once employees realize that the kind little things that they do to each other and do for each other are being recognized, are being promoted, it makes them want to do more. So always, if you're stuck with what to talk about when it comes to promoting your employer brand, start with kindness. I think in all walks of life, when people are thinking about what they want from an employer, what they want from a manager, what they want from a team, there's so many different things that they want, but one thing that everyone has in common is kindness. So always start with that as your base, and move from there. So that's the 5 tips that I wanted to share with everyone today of what to do if you've only got a shoestring budget for your employer branding. Get used to producing content, know your platforms, get a culture, always tell the truth, and start with kindness. You can't go wrong with kindness. So I hope this has been a very useful session to everyone who's watching today. We've actually got a number of ebooks on the BrioHR platform that focus on recruitment, talent acquisition, culture, and building the employer brand, especially how to produce meaningful job ads. I've got a whole chapter in one of our ebooks just on producing very interesting, very compelling, very important job ads. They're all free to download. So do feel free to go to our website and look at our free ebooks that you can download. My colleague, who is also called Jon, has been curating some of the comments that have been coming in whilst we have been talking. So there's just a few questions that have come in during this session. The first one is, how do you measure employer branding? A very, very difficult thing to measure. If you are working for a small company, you don't have the tools and analytics about where the candidates are coming from in order to analyze in a meaningful way how the employer brand is doing. If you are lucky enough to have a very advanced ATS that can track exactly where your candidates are coming from, can do kind of A/B testing on the job post and the social media posts that you're doing, you can really start to build a picture of how well your employer brand is performing. But if you don't have access to these applicant tracking systems and recruitment systems, which are, to be honest, very, very expensive, then you can only really do it in a much more anecdotal way, as in, how is the quality of the candidates that you are attracting improving? How many candidates are getting past your first round of interviews? How many candidates are getting past the second round, the third round? How many candidates are getting hired per ad that you produce? And what is the quality of those candidates? Are they passing probation? Are they doing well in their first performance appraisals? And it really, again, you can't measure what you can't see. So it really comes down to how, if you have the tools available to you in order to track the performance of your job ads and your social media, but also, do you have the tools to measure the performance of your new employees? And then being able to balance those two and match those two together. But in reality, if you are working in a startup, a scale up, an SME, and you don't have the budget to use a very strong applicant tracking system, then it has to rely on anecdotal evidence, which is how fast are you hiring candidates and what's the quality of those candidates. Those are the two key metrics that you have to start looking at. So the next question is, who should be involved in employer branding? And again, fundamentally, whose KPI does this affect? HR is responsible for recruiting. They're directly measured on that KPI. But at the end of the day, if you're hiring for your finance team, the faster you can find someone for that team and the higher quality of the candidate, the better it is for the finance team. The same with the marketing team, the tech team, etc., etc. They should want you to be able to find the best candidate as fast as possible. And if they want that, they should be very open to helping you with the employer branding. So ultimately, from a KPI point of view, from a performance point of view, it does come down to the HR team. But in reality, you should be trying to get everybody involved. You should be trying to tell the employee experience of the marketing team, of the tech team, of the finance team. You do need to get everybody involved and you do need to get input and buy-in from everybody. But ultimately, it's the responsibility of the HR team to be able to produce the employer brand in the first place. You might have help from a creative team, a marketing team, a content team, and you definitely need the buy-in of your senior management team. That they need to be behind you. But in terms of whose responsibility is, it's the recruitment team and the HR team who have to drive all of the initiatives. Third question: what are some of the mistakes to avoid in developing an employer brand? I think again we've spoken about telling lies in your employer brand, promoting things which are not true or really exaggerating things. It will harm your employer brand so much if you're lying. And again, we went through the reasons, but it will create higher attrition amongst your new employees. It will create it will contribute to creating a toxic environment within your company, and ultimately you're not going to be attracting the kind of candidates that you need to if you're basing attracting them on lies. You need to use what your company is really like. Otherwise, you're going to attract people who are not going to fit into what your company is really like. They're going to fit into what you've told them the company is like, but the company isn't really like that. So you're going to end up attracting the wrong type of candidates for your company. If you're spending so much time on producing videos and visuals and amazing copywriting, don't let that time go to waste by weaving lies and exaggerations into that content. How can HR professionals promote their organization's employer brand? And I think again, it's a good question. I think we've covered it a lot. I think the two key platforms are your job ads and your social media channels, and it's different all over the world. And I'm not exactly a young man. I don't keep entirely up to date with what are the best social media channels to use. But you can't go wrong with LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. There's many more that you can use, and depending on whether or not you're trying to attract fresh graduates, juniors, or very senior people, you might want to change which ones you use. I hear people talking about TikTok. I've never used it or logged in, but it's something that the younger generation is very actively on, and you need to pick the channels which are going to get your employer brand out to as big a market as possible and as relevant market as possible. So we really focus on not necessarily job boards, but your job ads. And picking the right social media channels for the right jobs. And I think the last question we've had come in is employer branding only an issue for more established companies? I would say definitely not. The more established companies, they have a natural employer brand by virtue of their commercial brand. Large companies, they will have a very large marketing team. They have a commercial brand, and everyone is aware of that commercial brand. And in some ways, they don't necessarily need a strong employer brand. They just need to manage the positivity versus negativity of that employer brand. When someone sees an advert from I don't know, I'll use an extreme version, but when someone sees an advert from Google for a job, they don't need to read up about who Google is, about what it's like to work in Google. Most people know. So you don't really need to focus too much on your employer brand if you're a very large company. It's just about starting to tell stories about what it's like to work there and trying to really go hard on the employee experiences. But when you work for an SME, a startup, a scale up, so many people that you want to attract will never have heard of your company. And that's a big problem because most people don't necessarily want to join a company that they've never heard of. They don't want to jump into that unknown. So not only do you have to do what larger companies do, which is to manage that positivity versus negativity of the employer brand, you actually have to get the brand itself out there. You have to play a role in making sure that when a candidate sees your job ad, they already know who the company is. I don't actually post that many ads. I spend a lot of time hunting people on LinkedIn. And most of the employer branding that I do is not necessarily to attract candidates to apply for jobs in my company. It's so that when I message someone on LinkedIn or try to headhunt them, they've already heard of my company. So I try to pump out so much content on LinkedIn so that when I do message someone, they don't have to say who is BrioHR, or they don't have to think who is BrioHR. They already know who BrioHR is, and they're kind of excited or interested to get a message from me. And that's what you really need to focus on when you work for a company that doesn't have a widely known brand name. You actually need to put a lot of work in to getting that brand name out there in the first place, as well as managing that the positivity versus the negativity of the employer brand itself. So I think that covers all the questions that have come up so far. Please do feel free to reach out to myself if you have any further questions on employer branding. I'm very excited to talk about employer branding, so give me a buzz anytime. Thank you for tuning in. Do look out for the webinars which are coming up in the future. And yeah, feel free to reach out anytime. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.